The Imperial Japanese Navy worked out something about itself long before the Pacific War arrived. It could not outbuild the United States. It had accepted that as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one, and it built an entire strategy on the answer. If you cannot have more ships, have better ones. Every hull individually stronger than the foreign hull it would meet. That was the doctrine. It was not stupid, and it had worked before. On the 4th of November, 1937, in a building dock at the Kure Naval Arsenal, they laid the keel of the ship that was meant to settle the argument. On the paperwork, she was Warship number 1. Finished, she displaced a little under 72,000 tons at full load, which made her the largest battleship ever built by anybody before or since. She carried 9 guns of a bore no warship has ever carried. And the ordnance documents recorded those guns as 40 centimeters. They were not 40 centimeters. The real figure was 46, 18.1 inches, and it stayed a state secret until after the war ended. The false number was camouflage. It went into the type designation, into the ammunition tables, into every document that moved through the Navy Ministry, and it held. So here is the shape of the thing. A navy that had staked everything on being visibly better than an enemy. It could never outnumber, built the most powerful naval gun in history, and then classified the one number that made it powerful. Yamato fired her main battery at enemy warships on exactly 1 day in her life. Her sister Musashi never fired hers at a ship at all. If you want the part almost nobody tells, the intercepted message that made all of this pointless, subscribe before we get there. Because in October of 1943, American codebreakers read a Japanese signal referring to ammunition for a special type 40-centimeter gun. They believed it. That one intercept is the reason the largest guns ever built changed nothing whatsoever. We will come back to it at the end and not before. Sasebo, before dawn, the 12th of March, 1934. The 21st Torpedo Flotilla had put to sea in bad weather for an exercise, and among the ships was a small torpedo boat called Tomozuru. In the dark, she rolled over. The rolling that killed her was within the limits her own designers had set for her. The investigation found the cause quickly enough. Low metacentric height. In plain terms, she was carrying more weight higher up than her hull could balance, and once she went past a certain angle, there was nothing left to bring her back. The Navy then went and checked the stability of every vessel it owned, and did not like what it found. The man who took the blame was Rear Admiral Fujimoto Kikuo, head of the Basic Design section of the Naval Technical Department. He was born on the 12th of January, 1888, in Ishikawa Prefecture, and he had come up through the naval architecture course at Tokyo Imperial University, which was the standard route for the men who drew Japan's warships. He had inherited his job at the worst possible moment. The Washington Treaty had capped how many big ships Japan could have, so the Navy General Staff tried to make up the shortfall by demanding more fighting power out of every hull that was not capped. More guns, more torpedo tubes on smaller and smaller displacements. Somebody had to make those numbers meet, and Fujimoto was the man with the pencil. He was innovative where his predecessor had been conservative, and that predecessor was still very much alive. Vice Admiral Hiraga Yuzuru had trained him and then fallen out with him, and the two had a running feud over, among other things, what the future battleship should look like. After Tomozuru, Hiraga said in public what he had been saying in private, that Fujimoto's ambition had pushed him into untried methods, electric welding among them, and into accepting centers of gravity that no prudent designer would accept. Tomozuru tipped the argument. Hiraga's views won. After 1935, hull welding was very largely abandoned in favor of riveting, and that decision is going to matter a great deal later. Fujimoto was suspended. Then, in September of 1935, while he was still out, 58 ships on maneuvers ran into a typhoon east of Iwate and came home with structural damage that should not have been possible. The Fourth Fleet incident confirmed everything the first one had suggested. Japanese warships were being asked to carry too much. He was reinstated on the 9th of January 1935. He died the following day of a cerebral hemorrhage, aged 46. One account, and it is the one told most often in Japan, has him celebrating his return with too much sake. Another version, written up in the American naval press decades later, has him simply sacked as the scapegoat and dying a broken man. The accounts disagree about the manner of it. They do not disagree that the Navy General Staff had made the demands and that the designer paid for them. Then there is Izaki, his protege in the design bureau, who is the detail worth holding on to. He was dismissed. The Admiralty staff later brought him back, But he was never permitted to design a ship again. Instead, they put him on the hull strength calculations for the new battleship. The man judged unfit to draw a warship spent the rest of the decade checking whether the biggest warship in the world would hold together. The job itself went to Rear Admiral Fukuda Keiji, who had Hiraga's backing, which meant Hiraga now effectively had control of the program. So the largest warship ever constructed was drawn by the winning side of an argument about whether the Navy had been asking its ships for too much. In 1935, Japan walked away from the treaty system, and in October it issued the requirement for the new battleship. The work went to the 4th Department of the Naval Technical Department. This time, unusually, there was a real deadline. The project designation was a 140. The requirement did not appear out of nowhere. Underneath it sat Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine, the belief that a war against the United States would be settled in one enormous fleet engagement somewhere in the Western Pacific. The Americans would come, they would be met, better ships would beat more ships on the day. So the specification asked for a ship carrying at least 8 guns of 46 centimeters and armor capable of taking a hit from her own main battery at ranges between 20,000 and 35,000 meters. Underwater protection was to absorb at least 10 torpedoes with warheads of 300 kilograms. High speed, long legs, because the Pacific is wide. Through March of 1937, the department produced 24 separate designs, and the one they took forward was Plan A-140F6. The competition was internal, and it was fought hard. Fujimoto had wanted the main turrets grouped forward, all of them, which shortens the armored citadel and therefore saves an enormous amount of weight. Hiraga hated it, partly on blast grounds and partly on principle. Hiraga's own answer, A-140I, was shelved because it would have required manufacturing 2 different sizes of 46-centimeter turret, which was absurd. There was a long argument about diesels, which promised extraordinary range and which Japan lost on reliability. Now read that requirement again, because it is not asking what it appears to ask. It is not asking for a ship that can win a war. It is asking for a ship that cannot be defeated by any single opponent in one afternoon. Those are different orders, and they produce different ships. And here is the constraint that everybody else treated as fixed. Japanese planners made a shrewd assumption about the Americans, which was that any American battleship would have to fit through the Panama Canal because a fleet that cannot move between 2 oceans is not a fleet. From that, they estimated the coming American ship at 35,000 tons, 33 knots, 9 16-inch guns, 880 feet long. Japan had no canal. Japan could build as wide as it liked. The accepted plan came out with a beam too broad to pass the locks, and that single fact is the design. They laid the keel at Kure on the 4th of November, 1937, and the first thing they built was not the ship, it was the concealment. Take the design apart, and every choice is a trade somebody paid for. Beam over dockability. That extra width bought volume, stability, and armor, and it cost them the entire industrial base. There was no yard in Japan that could build her as she stood. The construction dock at Kure had to be deepened by about a meter so that the ship could float out of it. The gantry crane straddling that dock was uprated to 100 tons. New docks went up at Yokosuka and Sasebo. Floating cranes of 350 tons and 150 tons were built to lift armor plate. Conventional turret layout over Fujimoto's mast forward arrangement. 2 turrets forward, 1 aft, the traditional pattern. That won the argument, and the cost fell on the men who would stand on her deck in 1944. Blast from the after 46-centimeter turret was so violent that the anti-aircraft weapons at the stern could never be worked at full effect. In a gun duel, that is invisible. Against aircraft, it is not. Concentrated armor over distributed armor. The plating went over the machinery and the magazines and almost nowhere else, which left bow and stern effectively unprotected, and the pumping arrangements could not compensate for serious flooding in either. And then the choice that needs explaining properly, because it is the one that decides how this ship dies. Think about a shell that falls short. It hits the water 50 or 100 meters in front of the target, and the natural assumption is that it stops there. It does not. It goes into the water still moving fast, and the nose flattens its own path out, and it keeps traveling under the surface. It then arrives at the side of the ship well below the waterline, underneath the armor belt, where the steel is thin. Japan did not learn this from theory. They learned it by shooting at one of their own hulls. In trials against the old hull, Tosa, a 41-centimeter shell, struck the water 25 meters short, kept going, and punched through the hull about 3.3 meters below the waterline. Those results were used a decade later when they drew this ship, so they hung a second belt of armor below the first, 200 millimeters thick, running down towards the bottom of the hull and thinning to just under 100. It worked. It made an underwater shell hit on this ship close to impossible. But two plates of armor have to meet somewhere, and where they met, they formed a seam. Remember what happened to welding after 1935? This belt was too thick to weld, so it was riveted. The seam sat at roughly the depth where a torpedo strikes, and its concave shape did the worst possible thing, which was to catch the force of an underwater explosion and funnel it straight into the join. Hold on to that seam. Now the guns, properly. Bore of 46 centimeters, barrel 20.7 meters long at 45 calibers. Each gun weighed 147.3 tons. The armor-piercing shell weighed 1,460 kilograms and left the muzzle at 780 meters per second, and at 45 degrees of elevation, it would travel 42 kilometers. Each turret weighed about as much as a destroyer, and here the sources differ between roughly 2,500 and 2,780 tons. So take the range rather than a tidy figure. 27 guns were built in total, the first completed in March of 1938 and proved at the Kamigakubi range. And none of that appears on the documents because it was forbidden to write down the real caliber. On paper it was 40 centimeters. Which brings us to the thing almost everybody believes about this ship, and it deserves a fair hearing. The common version is that Yamato was a monument to stupidity, a battleship laid down in 1937 by admirals who had somehow failed to notice that the aeroplane had already won, a dinosaur ordered by men looking backwards. It is believable, and it is believable for a very good reason, which is that Japan herself proved the point within a year of commissioning her. At Pearl Harbor and off Malaya. The duller documented answer is that in 1937, nobody was behaving as though the battleship was finished. Nobody. The United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy were all laying down fast battleships in the same window, spending the same kind of money. Japanese naval aviators, Yamato among them, had been arguing since 1933 that the best defense against American carriers was a carrier fleet of Japan's own. And Japan built carriers too in the same program, out of the same budget. The men who ordered this ship were not blind. They were hedging, like everyone else was hedging. The mistake was somewhere else entirely, and it is not visible yet. Yamato was commissioned on the 16th of December 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor. Which leaves one question worth asking. What is a secret this expensive actually for? The program was 5 hulls. Yamato at Kure, Musashi at the Mitsubishi Yard in Nagasaki, laid down on the 29th of March 1938, launched on the 1st of November 1940, commissioned on the 5th of August 1942, Shinano at Yokosuka, warship number 111, back at Kure, warship number 797, planned. Behind all of them sat Design A150, worked up between 1938 and 1941, 6 guns of 51 centimeters, the largest ever intended for a capital ship, with most of the paperwork destroyed at the end of the war. The concealment was its own production line. At Nagasaki, the slipway was screened behind a rope curtain that ran to 2,710 kilometers of rope and weighed 408 tons, and buying that much rope caused a shortage on the open market that local fishermen complained about. Contemporary Japanese accounts describe rope made from Chinese windmill palm, while most later histories call it sisal or hemp, so the sources do not agree even on what the curtain was made of. The Nagasaki yard was overlooked by most of the city, so a screen of 75,000 square meters went up, and in 1937, the secret police swept the surrounding area of foreign workers. At Kure, they fitted bamboo blinds to the dock-facing windows of the streetcars running from the station to the arsenal, so that passengers could not glance sideways on their way to work. And then there is Kashino, which is the detail a specialist carries around. The turrets could not go by land, and no ordinary cargo ship could lift them. So the Navy built a vessel whose entire reason for existing was to carry 46-centimeter gun turrets from Kure to the other yards. Laid down on the 1st of July 1939 at Nagasaki, commissioned on the 10th of July 1940, 2 enormous holds, a double hull, extra ballast for the days she sailed empty. Her first cargo was one of Musashi's turrets and a gun, and the moment it was hoisted aboard the battleship, they threw canvas over it. She was torpedoed and sunk by the American submarine Growler on the 4th of September, 1942. Then the program began to eat itself. Warship number 111, about 30% complete, was taken apart in 1942, and the material salvaged from her went into converting the old battleships Isa and Hyuga into hybrid carriers. The fourth Yamato became flight decks. Shinano, the third hull, was finished as an aircraft carrier instead of a battleship, and she was sunk on the 29th of November 1944, 10 days after commissioning and 17 hours into her maiden voyage, 65 miles off Honshu, by 4 torpedoes from a single American submarine, Archerfish. Her captain was credited at the time with sinking a 28,000-ton carrier. The post-war accounting found a ship of 72,000. Meanwhile, the fleet had given Yamato a name, Hoteru Yamato, Hotel Yamato. It came from the long stretches she spent at anchor at Truk as a floating headquarters, and it was not affectionate. Between arriving there on the 29th of August, 1942, and leaving on the 8th of May, 1943, she spent one single day away from the base. Musashi collected the matching joke, Musashi Ryokan, the Musashi Inn, and the Siam arrived on schedule. On the 25th of December 1943, 180 miles northeast of Truk, the submarine Skate fired 4 stern tubes at 2,200 yards. At least one hit near number 3 turret, tearing a hole roughly 75 feet long between frames 151 and 173. Then the upper magazines flooded through a small hole punched in the bulkhead by the failure of the joint between the upper and lower armor belts. 3,000 tons of water, the thing the Tosa trials had implied at sea in the dark from one torpedo, 27 guns built for 5 hulls, of which 2 ever mounted them. Across the Pacific, the Americans were building to a completely different rule, and they were building 4. The rule was the canal. The Iowa class came out at 45,000 tons, 33 knots, 9 16-inch 50 caliber guns, 860 feet on the waterline, and a beam that would pass the locks. Give that ship its due, because it deserves it. She was 6 knots faster than Yamato, and speed turned out to be the quality that mattered, because the job a battleship actually got in this war was not dueling other battleships. It was keeping station with fast carriers and putting up anti-aircraft fire. The Iowa could do that. Yamato could not quite. Both answers were rational. The American one happened to fit the war that arrived. Now, hold the 2 intelligence pictures side by side, because the symmetry is remarkable. Japan's pre-war estimate of the future American battleship was 35,000 tons, 33 knots, 9 16-inch guns, 880 feet. The Iowa came out at 45,000 tons, 33 knots, 9 16-inch guns, 860 feet. Japan guessed the Iowa almost exactly and designed specifically to beat it. The Americans guessed Yamato wrong in every particular that counted. And the reason is not technical, it is institutional, and it is written down. In December of 1936, the Navy minister sat with representatives of the political parties to explain the naval budget, and the American ambassador reported what he said. The new armament scheme was not aimed at numerical parity. It sought a fleet suited to national circumstances at minimum cost. And the Navy, he said, intended to preserve its secrets concerning naval construction. There is the whole difference in one sentence. The United States did not need a qualitative edge because it had a quantitative one, and could therefore afford to build in the open and let everyone see. Japan needed the edge. And precisely because it needed the edge, it could not show it. Because a treaty-breaking ship announced is a ship that gets answered. Who paid for that in the field? The 3,000 men who spent 2.5 years aboard a vessel too valuable to be risked, and were then sent out in it once. Which raises a question that has nothing to do with steel at all. What is an advantage worth if the enemy is not permitted to know it exists? The answer is in a decrypted message from October of 1943. The deception did not partly work. It worked completely from beginning to end, and that is precisely what ruined it. Follow it in order. In January of 1938, the American naval attaché in Tokyo, Captain Harold Bemis, correctly reported that Japan was building 2 battleships considerably over the 35,000-ton treaty limit. The informal club of foreign attachés in Tokyo broadly agreed, and the British, German, and French guesses all landed around 45,000 tons. The Soviet attaché went the other way entirely and concluded that Japan could not manufacture guns that size without importing the machinery to do it. Every one of those estimates understated the ships. Not one of them identified the 18.1-inch armament. In October of 1942, with Yamato commissioned and at sea, the Office of Naval Intelligence still put the class at 35,000 tons with 9 16-inch guns. In February of 1943, interrogation of a survivor from the submarine I-1, sunk off Guadalcanal, confirmed that there were 9 barrels. By the spring of 1943, Pacific Fleet Intelligence had them at 9 17.7-inch guns. In July, a captured aviator gave up Shinano's conversion to a carrier, and then in October of 1943, an intercepted Japanese message referred to ammunition for a special type 40-centimeter gun. The Americans read it, and it pushed them back towards 16 inches where they had started. Sit with that. American code breakers successfully penetrated Japanese communications, extracted the truth about the paperwork, and were carried further from the truth about the weapon. The Japanese had been seeding false clues that these ships mounted 16-inch guns rather than 18. It was a designation invented as camouflage in the middle of the 1930s, and it performed exactly as designed one last time at the worst possible moment. 40 centimeters was true everywhere that mattered. True in the type name, true on the ammunition tables, true in Washington, true in a signal that American cryptanalysts decrypted and believed. The only place in the world where it was false was inside the barrel, and the historians still cannot agree on it. Most accounts give the cover designation as 40 centimeters. Some specialist writing gives it as 41 centimeter special type. There are researchers who question how firmly the whole cover story is documented at all. 80 years on, we cannot settle which false number the Navy used, and that disagreement is itself the measure of how well the file was kept. Now put that against the doctrine that paid for the ship. Kantai-Kessen requires an enemy who comes. A margin nobody can see deters nobody, provokes nobody, and shapes no decision in any war room anywhere on Earth. The Americans built the Iowa against a ship that did not exist, and it cost them nothing at all, because they were never once obliged to fight the ship that did. Yamato was not a weapon that failed. She was an argument that was never permitted to be made. So the assumption we started with dissolves. She was not useless because she was too big or too late, or because the men who ordered her had failed to notice aircraft. Everybody was building battleships in 1937, and Japan built carriers too. She was useless because the only thing she bought, 6 centimeters of margin over anything afloat, was classified by the same Navy that paid for it. Beam over dockability, armor over reach, rivets over welds, the seam over the join, the secret over the threat. On the 6th of April 1945, she took on fuel at Tokuyama for the run to Okinawa, and the men there climbed down inside the tanks to pump out what was left in the bottom. The famous version says she was given only enough for a one-way trip. That is disputed. Around 4,000 tons went aboard, and Gaska and Dulin record the force fuel to 60%, rather than the 40% their orders authorized. Ensign Yoshida Mitsuru, the junior radar officer on her bridge, believed the one-way story. What the crew believed is the fact that operated. She was sunk the next day. Of a crew of over 3,000, fewer than 300 came out of the water. Kure, 1946. In a yard by the water lie the barrels that never went to sea, the ones cast and bored for ships that were cancelled or converted or cut up on the slip. There are photographs. In May, Australian soldiers walking along the line of unfinished 46-centimeter guns. In February, gun number 23 sitting on the deck of an American landing ship, waiting to be taken away. A man in a foreign uniform putting his hand flat on the muzzle of a gun whose size had been a capital secret for 10 years. And finding out how wide it was by looking at it. 46 centimeters. In the end, somebody simply measured it in daylight and wrote the number down. And by then, it did not matter what the document said.